What do we need?
That's it, we're good.
Okay, they're stuck together.
Is this last week or next week? Is this the last week or?
This is the last week.
Okay, so next week is your seminar? We can share.
Can share.
Yes.
Everybody had the book reference or need a book reference? I'll probably email this, scan it, and send it out anyway.
Yeah, it's in my phone. Everything's in my phone. Homerollers, I can't even stop. That's not good.
Or did I hand out the wrong thing? No, I saw it.
I guess no,
Is that, that's not the book reference? I have the book reference. Or,
You got your shot.
what's that?
Is this the?
Two of them?
Yeah. I didn't know, he asked me to hand it out.
That might be smarter to have done it here.
Everybody get everything?
Then go get the sugar.
Well,
Steve,
yeah.
I think the mic was humming, we'll wait, it just quit.
Hey, let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord, again, with grateful thanks for the day and for all that will bring us. And may our hour in this time be conducive to wisdom. And may our teaching and learning be acceptable in your sight. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, you should have two handouts. One you have before, it's the books. Okay.
There was just some
Good,
buzz
yes,
going
thank
on.
you. One's the books, and the other one has the title at the top, Christian Faith. And those who are not Christians, I'll come to that in a minute. I would like today to have more discussion than we've had before. Of course, being a former professor, I like to talk, so maybe I will fill up the hour anyway we're talking, but I don't plan, at least not now. I would like to hear more from you. I want to start with the books, because I didn't go through these before. I want to tell you what's there. So if you're interested, you can kind of note that. This is a selection of books that I have read. I think the one I have benefited most from is the one at the top, Dale Allison's Encountering Mystery, Religious Experience in the Secular Age. And it looks like this. Dale is professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, and he was at one time at Pittsburgh, and we got to know each other in Pittsburgh and still good friends. So we communicate on this and fairly often, going back and forth. He's a very unique person because he himself has had striking paranormal experiences, some of which he talks about in this book. Now, you see the subtitle, Religious Experience in a Secular Age. He is addressing a religious problem. I must say he's not doing it from an orthodox point of view, but he's doing it very open to what we are learning or can learn through paranormal experiences. The next one, Threshold, Terminal Lucidity. This is a very good book on those who wake up before death. Sometimes people who are clearly brain damaged, and this is the great puzzle. People who have been suffering from Alzheimer's for years, and have descended into serious brain damage. I know we've got a new member of the class, and we're gonna have to get these out. Going in the back. All right, threshold. What's meant is the threshold between life and death, or you might say between death and life. Seriously brain damaged people suddenly waking up and talking very lucidly to, for example, family who happen to be gathered around. Noticeable for nurses who were in care. It's a striking look on this and on how many cases like this are reported. So if you're interested in pursuing that, that's a very good book. Barrington, Mary Rose, Jots, right? We've talked about Jots. This is a very good source. How she explains them, I don't necessarily agree with. But this is a great problem with everything paranormal, is the explanations. Lots of theories, little proof. Very characteristic. Then Barrington again talking about psychical research. Now this is a woman who very much represents the point of view of telepathic power. A great deal, she thinks, can be explained through telepathic work among individuals. For example, when we're talking about seances, her explanation, and that which is coming from sources that very much agree with this line of thought, is that the people in the seance, for example, they're interested in communicating with a certain person, and they all are interested in this because they knew this person or they're interested in this person. So the telepathic thesis is that with the medium together, they actually create the sort of seance effects. And the great example of that was, again, the Philip experiment, which you can find on Wikipedia, where this guy Philip is invented by a group, and they all kind of make up a story about they put him back in the 1600s. They flesh out his personality, whether he's married and all that stuff. And then they have a seance, and lo and behold, and they're all concentrated on Philip, who doesn't exist, and never has existed, and they get seance type effects. To the point where Philip doesn't appear, but the table moves, which is something that happens in seances, even stands on one leg. And this has been repeated in other instances, and they've gotten similar results. Now, this stands opposed. People who solidly believe in this oppose this to the effect of spirits. On the other hand, the argument for spirits, because of the kinds of information that are coming through and so forth, are quite strong. So these two kind of arguing about what's right and what's not, and maybe it's a little of both. Maybe it's something like that. But Barrington very much in favor of telepathic power. Carlos Eyre, They Flew. Now this is mainly about a friar, a priest in the 16th century in Italy who flew, that is to say, levitated in his, when he would celebrate Mass, he would levitate. And apparently hundreds of people saw this, and it was carefully investigated by the Catholic Church, and he was declared a saint. That's a very interesting case because this friar couldn't get into the order of Franciscans. The Franciscans couldn't get into any order because he was held not intelligent enough And apparently he was a very simple guy, without any great qualification. And it was simply through persistence and other people supporting him, he finally got in. And then it was some time after that that he qualified as priest. There's one great talent, if you call that, or one grace that was given him, was certainly not intelligence. It was this levitation. And Ira goes into great detail in talking about the number of witnesses and so forth. He himself is Catholic, and he thinks this has a lot to do with Catholic acceptance of divine miracles. Although, I must say, the book doesn't clearly define out what a divine miracle is in distinction from a nature event. Because we know for a fact that levitation occurs elsewhere, especially India is known for it. So it's not just something that happens in the Catholic context or with this friar. The next one, Bruce Grayson. This is a classic on near-death experiences. It is the most solid book, I think, there. It's by a psychiatrist who got very interested in the work, in what was happening. He himself had experiences with patients and so forth, which got him interested. But that's a classic, and certainly to be recommended. Then Tony Jinks, another book on Jots, Disappearing Object. Then Elizabeth Lord Mayor, Extraordinary Knowing. This is a good elemental book on unusual abilities, especially telepathy. But it's easily read until you get to the end of the book, and it has some rather difficult accounting of experiments where you get some very technical language. For example, about influence on dreams, experiments that have been done. Otherwise, it's a very accessible book. It's written to be that way. And she herself is, what was she, medical doctor? I forget. Joseph McMonagle, Memoirs of a Psychic Spy. Now this is very interesting because he talks very frankly about his experiences. And just a story I haven't mentioned, I don't think, from my personal experience. Back some years ago, a professor from Prague, this was back in the communist era, came to Pittsburgh, and you wouldn't think I was that old, no. If I went for my hearing, you'd think I was 39. This was back in the 80s. Would have been in the 80s, maybe early 90s. And he told the story. No, it would have been in the 80s because it was still under communism. It would have been pretty much 86, 87, something like that. And he told the story about something was going on in Prague. And he said his wife was working for a Russian institute in Prague that was working on the problem of how to use mental energy to affect apparatus. So, for example, the example he gave, how to turn on a light mentally. So they had very sensitive instruments, and they would try, that's called psychokinesis, using power of the mind to do something. Now we know that experiments have been done with small objects, and some people are apparently talented in being able to move them. There are also films coming from Russia about a woman who was, they've shown her able to move objects on the table mentally. So apparently there is something to this, but that was very interesting that that he told that story about what was going on in Prague through a Russian institute. Raymond Moody, Proof of Life After Life, 7 Reasons, and that is a very good recent book. As a supplement to Grayson's book, I would solidly recommend it. It's very good. Following up. One of the things that he mentions in there, his thesis is that shared death experiences is stronger proof than near-death experience. And the reason is you get more people involved. So for example, a story of a woman, fairly famous story, she's in a kayak and they go over falls and hers turns upside down and gets stuck under the fall. And she gets rescued, but by that time she's deceased. And she's put up on the shore, and I think, Walt, if you remember this, something like 20 minutes being dead. But what her experience is, what she tells about later, is being above the people who have rescued her and put her down on the shore and are trying to revive her. And she knows who, and she can see it happen. She revives, she comes back, and she tells the story. So all of this is quite clear to her. Why is it a shared death experience? Because the people on the ground say that what she recounts is exactly right. Right? That's a shared death experience. Another one is an apparition where, for example, at a deathbed, there's a story of the family gathered around the mother, very beloved mother, dying, and someone notices there's an extra person, and it's the father of the family. And they all see him. They all see that. That's a shared death experience because you have witnesses, right? So it's interesting that that's what Moody is doing in this book. He's talking about shared death experiences. All right, Russell Targ, Harold Puthoff, Mind Reach. Scientists look at psychic abilities. This is an older book. What makes it most interesting is the one who wrote the introduction. Famous name, right? Margaret Mead. The book that led to the U.S. Army Psychic Spy program, in which Joe McGonigal participated. And again, you can look it up on the web, Stargate program, first of the United States Army, then of the CIA, discontinued 1995, but all kinds of speculation is that it's still going on. They're still pursuing it. And then the last one, Steve Taylor, Time Expansion. This is very interesting because it gets into how we experience time and how time is experienced in paranormal events. And I won't say any more about that, but if you're interested in pursuing it, it's an accessible book, not all that complex. So having said that, with any questions about, remember my whole effort in this course, in the 4 Sundays, was to introduce you to the manifolds. I'm not concentrating. We haven't concentrated on any one all that much. We have said some more about near-death experiences, but otherwise the effort has been to kind of cover a broad area of things that are going on. And I hope, in some sense, that succeeded. If you haven't known about them before, that you do, at least in some degree, now. Now, having said that, anyone want to ask or make a point about any of these books or subjects? Yeah, that's.
I'd just like to add, I believe the kayak story was Dr. Mary Neal.
Yeah.
And in addition to having that experience, of being able to see what they were doing, they were in a John that story, and she was really injured. I mean,
Yeah.
her legs were broken and
Right, yeah,
long recovery, but she was a doctor and then, has
Right.
gone on to
Right.
share multiple levels of that. It's really interesting.
and that brings up, another point? Someone had a hand up, yes,
I heard of, there was an operating nurse, a nurse in an operating room, that said that she had a number of patients report out-of-body experience. And so she, in the operating room, on top of some shelves, put some items that were clearly out of place for an operating room. And her report was that no one that had those experiences since that time reported those objects. So there's, that makes me wonder, when you have an out-of-body experience, what are you really seeing?
right. Yeah, that particular, episode, and generally those kinds of episodes are covered in Grayson.
Oh.
And, I'm not sure if they're in Moody's book, but, they're certainly in Grayson. So you're right, sometimes it's happened, people have identified something without it being purposely placed there. It was just up there, and later, because it was reported, they go look and say, yeah, that's there. But on the other hand, trying to plan for it, like you say, doesn't seem to work, at least not very well.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to make a point of, we have not talked about angels. Now, there's a lot of testimony about angels. There are two books that I'd like to mention, and I know this is kind of bad unless you have a pencil right ready, but the people who wrote the two books, one is Hope McDonald, both of them are women. Hope McDonald, When Angels Appear, and Joan Anderson, Where Angels Walk. Now, those are very much worth pursuing because there's a lot of testimony to that. Those books are available on Amazon, can be gotten. But let me give you one episode that I thought quite striking. And this is in this Encountering Mystery book. This is one episode. One that I read a long time ago, never forgotten it. And just in preparing for today, I picked up the book and went immediately to this little story. As a young mother looked out the kitchen window into the backyard, she noticed the garden gate had been left open. Her little 3-year-old daughter, Lisa, had toddled through the gate and was sitting casually on the railroad tracks playing with the gravel. The mother's heart stopped when she saw a train coming around the bend and heard its whistle blaring as she raced from the house, screaming her daughter's name. She suddenly saw a striking figure, clothed in pure white, lifting Lisa off the tracks. While the train roared past, this glorious being stood by the track with an arm around the child. Together, they watched the train go by. When the mother reached the daughter's side, Lisa was standing alone. Now that's a striking story. I mean, I guess my question was, why would you live that close to the railroad tracks? Maybe they had no choice. One of the great questions about angels is why they, as much as they apparently appear, why don't they help more often? And one of the great questions is, after going through the horrors of wars, why don't we get intervention? And this is one of the great puzzles we have no answer for. But before I go on, let me ask you to contribute from your own experiences or your own questions to this whole subject matter, of whatever it might be. Love it.
I'd like to go back to Raymond Moody. He had a book before the one listed
Yes.
here. And that's the one that I read years and years ago, which got me interested in the subject.
Right.
And he was a psychiatrist who just happened to have a patient who decided to talk about it.
Right. Yeah.
And then he talked to other patients, and they had had experiences but didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
That was just a comment about I think that's a 1970s
Right. That book is still available.
Yeah.
Um,
The other thing that I wanted to ask, is an angel the same thing as your, the spirit of God, or the third, this Trinity?
No, we don't associate that, no. Angels are well, this is a good question, what are they? Definitely not understood as one of the Trinity, as a person of the Trinity, no. Angels as discrete creatures as described in the Bible. So it's both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and certainly also in the Christian tradition, stories of angels. They are, whatever their origin, they are supernatural appearances that appear to help when they do appear. Now, one of the problems is that these kinds of appearances happen in other religions too, where they use their own language to talk about them. Now, this brings up a big question again about the universality of paranormal events. We've said they're not limited to Christianity. They're not even limited to any particular religion. It can happen to atheists, near-death experiences. So a great deal depends on our cultural context as to how we understand whatever happens. Okay?
Dr. Wilson, I know there's a hierarchy of angels, and my understanding is that they are helpers, and they have specific jobs to do, but I'm not sure if there's a hierarchy of angels
Yes.
in other
Well,
religions.
and certainly in the Catholic tradition, we have a hierarchy of angels, a lot of different things. Strictly speaking from the New Testament and the Old Testament, they appear to be mainly messengers. Now, the guardian angel of effect is certainly also part of Protestant tradition, but it's not anchored in the Bible. On the other hand, Catholic, they don't really need the Bible that much because they have tradition. Revelation can happen through tradition. So they can have tradition revelations, angel, whatever. Protestants, I think definitely we talk about angels, can talk about angels, should talk about them, but remember also the problem, why don't they appear more often? Why don't they help more often? Why, for example, allow a war like Second World War happen like that, where millions died? These are enigmas we have no answers for. It's just there. Other contributions before we go further? Yes.
This may be off the topic a little bit. Having been raised in the Catholic tradition, they talked a whole lot about the children that saw the Virgin Mary at Fatima and at Lourdes, and have they ever given any explanation? And of course, with Fatima, they were supposed to get this letter that was given to the Pope. There was a whole bunch of what I would call mythology around it. Interestingly enough, you don't hear, growing up, and of course I'm ancient, but we talked about it all the time. And
Everybody in the room is ancient.
I'm ancient. Anyhow, and you don't, I think it's interesting that you don't hear about it anymore. You know, and how I mean, that's a paranormal experience if you think about it, but how do you explain? And isn't it interesting that it was all encompassing and now you never hear about it?
I made a very brief comment last week, and we'll repeat it now as a lead to something else I'm going to say. What we call paranormal or supernormal could just as well be thought of as normal, because the incidences are so widespread. Yes, it's anecdotal, but the anecdotes are so widespread and so well described and so well defined that you really can't put them in a category of something other than normal. Okay, now, having said that, let me pose to the group the notion that we are so strongly conditioned by the way we grow up, by educational systems, by the way we are trained to think, okay, that we create this dichotomy between empirical, objective reality and subjective impression. They're not really different, because all of what we perceive up here. There isn't, an example, let's see, best example I can think of. The notion of time, okay, the time-space continuum. We don't know anything about time. We can't even prove that time exists. Everything that we know about time is inferential. We can't really measure it, okay? Clock time isn't time. It's an inference about the way the world works, okay? But we can't observe time directly. We can't prove it exists. We also can't prove that it doesn't exist. Einstein would tell, the time-space continuum, the fabric of time and space, he would say is relational, which is why time slows down sometimes.
Can I intervene?
Yeah, sure.
We call that generally the great opposition between materialism and the new insights into the spiritual or the higher. And I must say about time, I just agree. You can't. I'm really 39. I just look like I'm old. Now, this has been an enigma of my life. I've always looked really young. No, really old. Well, that apart. Thank you. Thank you. Other contributions? Okay.
I had an experience, 1968, December, of sitting at a light and having a drunk driver plow into my Volkswagen. And what happened was that as my head went against the windshield, not the windshield, the side window, I could see the cracks beginning to form in the window, and I was thinking how beautiful that was. That was really extraordinary. And then my head hit the steering wheel. I broke my nose, and again the cracks in the windshield were developing. In other words, I had an experience.
Time was slowing down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was fascinating. I've never had that experience before.
But that is what that last book is about.
Yes.
Steve Taylor's time expansion experience.
Yes.
Some very remarkable experiences related in there. Any others?
I mean, that seems pretty common. I used to whitewater raft all the time, and I was having my daughters, and I was in a 6-man raft, and we didn't have enough people, so I was in the back by myself. We went over a falls, and I remember looking down on my daughters, and I go, You know, I've rafted a lot of times and I've never remembered this view. And I could see them, all four of them, paddling and things like that. And it, you know, and they actually had pictures of me flying out of the raft. And it was so weird because, you know, that was probably just a split second, but it seems like I can still remember just kind of floating above them, you know, watching them paddle. And it was, yeah.
Well, that's something that's well documented.
Yeah.
Time slowing down. Others? Okay.
Two comments. One is this discussion. I fell off a ladder in January and hit my head. And my next memory was calling my wife. But I do cameras for a living, so actually I could go back and look at the cameras and watch what I did. And you would think I was laying on the ground, but if you watch the cameras, I got up, I put the ladder up, I put tools in my truck. No memory. Actually, I called my wife, I didn't even know where I was. It took about a half hour, but so it sort of fascinated me that my body kept going through logical motions, and yet my brain has no memory whatsoever. And that just sort of hit me. But I wanted to add, in this discussion, I think I have trouble. How do we handle these things with our biblical faith? And how do we know? Because I believe biblically, visions can be gifts from God.
I'm going to come to that right now, if you could, but hold your question.
That's good.
Because I'm not saying I've answered it. All right, but let's go to this one. The other handout. I'm just going to read through it and comment on it. Now, first of all, let me say that ordinary paranormal experiences. I had a good question last week. What does all this have to do with Christianity? First of all, I think paranormal experiences, insofar as they occur everywhere, must be part of creation. That is to say, they're just there, created, and that God has created them. They are part of creation. When we get into special events like near-death experiences and so forth, there we get into an area where it's not so clear what exactly is happening. But things like Jot, I think Jot has always been there and happens everywhere when it happens, if you think it really happens. I happen to think it does happen. But let's go to this page. I'm reading through it and we'll comment on it. Christian faith and those who are not Christians. Questions and answers of a Protestant theologian writing back in the 1960s. And that theologian was Heinrich Ott. The Answer of Faith. It's in another language, it's in German, so this is translated some. The questions about God's work among persons of other faiths or of no religious faith. The questions are about those. And the questions are these. This is coming from Ott's book. Is his or her relationship to the neighbor one of moral responsibility and love? I'm quoting Matthew 25. What you've done to one of the least of these, my brothers, you have done to me. So again, an important question about, is God working among persons of other faiths? Is his or her relationship to the neighbor one of moral responsibility and love? Next question. Is her or his life full and open to the future? And third, does he or she trust that in death he or she is falling into a wonderful mystery? And let me comment on the word wonderful. Wonderful has two senses. One is sort of the wonderful, wonderful, emotionally. The other one is full of wonder. So I think at this point, full of wonder is a better understanding. Does he or she trust that in death they're falling into a mystery that is full of wonder? The positive answers to these questions, according to what Ott wrote, correspond to Christian faith in that Christ is love and truth. Christ opens the future to and for us. And Christ wills to give us the certainty that we are never left alone. And while positive answers are not equal to conversion to belief in Christ, they are intimations of God's gracious activity in encountering individuals among all people everywhere. Now this has become an important topic in Christian theology, is how do we talk about God's work among the peoples outside of the Christian faith? Because for a long time in Christian Orthodoxy they were all lost unless you converted them. Now, that wasn't always the case. There were a lot of very conservative Orthodox who didn't think that way, but there was enough of the other. You've got to convert them or they're lost. We have certainly passed beyond that into a far more open horizon for understanding other religions. Now let me comment on this. Just think about these questions. Okay, go back to the questions. Is his or her relationship to the neighbor one of moral responsibility and love? Is her or his life full and open to the future? Does he, she trust that in death he, she is falling into a mystery that is full of wonder? Okay, what have we also described according to evidence? Near-death experiences. Think about it again. The effects of near-death experience. What do people say? The majority have very positive comments to make about what they have learned. That it was a love experience and their life has been changed by it. They have no fear of death. And they're open to the future, to what may come. So just think about these questions in relation to what people say they have learned through near-death experiences. Is his or her relationship to the neighbor one of moral responsibility and love? Is her or his full life is his or her life full and open to the future? And does he, she trust that in death he, she is falling into a mystery full of wonder? Now that strikes me as very interesting, that what was applied at that time for Ott when he wrote that was Christianity and other religions. And yet it applies to what people say they learned from near-death experiences. Now, am I the only one that's impressed by that? Or do you see what I'm talking about? He wrote that back in the 60s. Not about near-death experience. It didn't have anything to do with it. It had to do with how Christians regard people in other faiths. Do we talk about Christ being present? Well, New Testament, Christ is Lord, Lord of all. Philippians, every knee shall bow in heaven and on earth, etc. Christ is Lord. Christ present, not just in Christianity, but working throughout the world. And in your death experiences. Now, I kind of come to a point where I'm done, but it's been an interesting four weeks, 4 sessions, 4 Sundays, and I appreciate your participation. I always recognize faithful few who are very good about attending, and I'm very, very appreciative of you doing that. And I hope you've learned, or at least something, about all this paranormal. Welcome.
I can't let this go without saying, 4 years ago, John got me thinking about a book called The Indivisible Mind, 900 pages long. And I read it, and there was a chapter on near-death experiences. And I got to that, and I said, well, this is myth, this isn't very important, and I just skipped through it. So his wife gave me a couple more books, and Amazon gave me a book, and if I read this, I would enjoy that. And this list that he has given you is one after the other that he keeps giving to me that I have read over the years. And I would say, as a personal testimony, that this has hugely impacted my understanding of what Jesus said and has confirmed it. And things like consciousness that I gave very little thought to, and life after death, yeah, I believe that. But now I read in one of the books he mentioned by Grayson, he has a chapter called Does Consciousness Continue? And his answer is almost always, and then he goes on with the sentence. To me, that's almost 100%. So while I have always believed in life after death, I am now convinced that our consciousness continues after our physical body dies. And I'm almost 100% certain of that, and live accordingly. And it's come because of John getting me to read all these books. So you'll go home and you'll set the list aside and forget it. But if you want to blow your mind, read some of these books. They're just absolutely beyond comprehension, many of these things that are going on. So John, I thank you
Well,
personally.
I think that either have a good input or a really bad one. I wish you well with the subject matter in the future. I certainly also wish you well with your Christian faith, that it may be deepened by all of this and not in any way diminished, that it may go deeper.
When
Thank
I
you.
read the Moody book,
Pardon?
when I read the first Moody book, like I said, I think he wrote it in the 70s. I didn't read it until the 90s, or 80s, probably late 80s. I decided that I wanted to be awake when I died. I wanted to have the full experience
I wanted to know.
of what it was going to
It
be
may
like.
be given, it may not be given. In any case, you keep the faith. Faith is what's important, not what you may or may not experience. Remember that. Thank you.
I think I left my book over